The knock came at exactly 12, loud enough to rattle the frost in the window panes and wake half of Brakey from its Hogmanay haze. Mrs. Elspeth Grant, who lived alone at the end of Church Lane, later swore she knew the moment something was wrong, not because of the hour, but because whoever stood outside knocked once, paused and knocked again with the calm patience of someone who knew they would be answered. Elspeth did not answer. No one did. By the time the village stirred the next morning, Elspeth Grant was dead. She was found seated upright in her armchair, a tartan blanket folded neatly over her knees, the fire cold to grey ash. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were latched. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. Her teacup sat on the side table, untouched, the surface of the tea unbroken by a single ripple. If not for the unnatural stillness of her body and the faint bluish tinge at her lips, it might have looked as though she had simply dozed off. The village constable, Alec Fraser, felt unease settle in his stomach the moment he stepped inside. Locked rooms were bad enough. Locked rooms with no apparent cause of death were worse. The doctor from the next town arrived mid-morning and frowned his way through a cursory examination. No wounds, no bruises, no smell of gas. The doctor eventually muttered something about the heart, though he sounded unconvinced even as he said it. What truly unsettled everyone was what lay on the small hall table just inside the front door. A single brass door knocker rested there, heavy and old, shaped like a lion's head. It did not belong to Elspeth Grant's cottage. Her door had never had a knocker at all, only a plain iron handle polished smooth by years of use. Yet there it was, placed squarely on a folded square of white cloth, as deliberate as an offering. The screws that once fixed it to a door were clean, not bent or torn free. Whoever removed it had taken their time. Constable Fraser questioned the neighbours. No one admitted to knocking at midnight. A few claimed they'd heard something. One knock, perhaps two, but Hogmanay was a noisy affair, full of late-night visitors and whiskey-loosened memories. Someone suggested it might have been a prank. Someone else muttered about first footing gone wrong. No explanation fit the facts. The cloth beneath the knocker added another layer of strangeness. It was embroidered with a simple pattern of thistles and initials stitched in blue thread, e.g. Elspeth's own handiwork, according to the women of the village, though no one could recall seeing that particular cloth before. It was too clean, too carefully folded, as if it had been waiting for that exact purpose. By afternoon, rumour had begun to harden into fear. Locked doors meant secrets. Midnight knocks meant warnings or debts long unpaid. The fact that Elspeth had no known enemies only made it worse. She was quiet, kept herself to herself, attended kirk, paid her bills. If someone could come for her so neatly, so silently, then no one in Brakey was truly safe. The district police were notified, and with them came a name that travelled ahead like a sigh of relief mixed with irritation: Hamish Macbeth. When Constable Fraser hung up the phone, he looked again at the lion-headed knocker on the hall table. It seemed almost to be watching him, its metal eyes dull and patient, as if it knew it would soon be asked to explain itself. Hamish Macbeth arrived just before dusk, his police car crunching over frost-hardened gravel as if it resented being disturbed. He stepped out slowly, raincoat buttoned wrong at the collar, his expression already apologetic, as though he was sorry for intruding on the village's misery. Constable Fraser met him at the gate and launched straight into an explanation, but Hamish raised a hand, listening more to the wind than the words. Inside the cottage, Hamish paused longer than the others had. He didn't go straight to the body. Instead, he stood in the doorway, breathing in the room, letting his eyes wander in no particular hurry. He noticed the neatness first, not cleanliness but order. The chair aligned with the hearth, the blanket folded with care, not pulled up for warmth. Elspeth Grant had arranged herself before sitting down, as if expecting to remain that way. Only then did he look at her face. The doctor's theory of a weak heart might have satisfied a report, but it didn't satisfy Hamish. There was tension in the jaw that sleep did not leave behind. Fear, perhaps, or shock. Something had startled her badly enough to stop the heart that had beaten steadily for 70 years. He turned to the hall table and studied the brass knocker. "That's a handsome thing," he said mildly. "Doesn't belong here." "No, sir," Fraser replied. "We checked the door. No marks at all." Hamish crouched and lifted the knocker, feeling its weight. He turned it over, examining the screw holes. "These were taken out proper," he murmured. "No rush, no tearing. Whoever removed it had the right screwdriver and the time to use it. He set it back exactly as he'd found it, aligning it square with the cloth, and they wanted it seen. The cloth itself held his attention next. He didn't touch it at first, only traced the embroidered initials with his eyes. "She stitched this herself?" "Aye. That's what Mrs. Calder said." Hamish nodded. "Then she chose it. Or she knew who did." They moved through the cottage room by room. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. No hidden bottles, no scattered papers. The windows were latched from the inside, but Hamish noticed faint scuffing on the sill in the back room, so light it could have been dismissed as old ware. He said nothing, only made a quiet note in his head. Outside, a few villagers lingered, pretending to busy themselves while watching Hamish with the hope that he might explain the unexplainable. He spoke to them gently, asking the same questions Fraser had already asked, but in a different way. Not what they'd seen, how they'd felt. When he asked about the knock, most answers were vague. Then he spoke to Mrs. Calder, who lived 2 cottages down. She was a sharp-eyed woman with a mouth that tightened whenever she thought she might be judged. Hamish noticed how quickly she answered some questions and how slowly others. "A knock at midnight's nothing strange on Hogmanay," she said too quickly. "Folk are in and out all night." "But you remember it," Hamish said softly. She hesitated, just a fraction too long. "I remember a sound," she said. "Could have been a door anywhere." Hamish smiled faintly. "Did you look out?" "No." Her eyes flicked, not toward the lane, but toward Elspeth's door. As he thanked her and moved on, Hamish's gaze returned to the cottage. A locked room, a deliberate knock, a knocker that didn't belong, and a woman who had prepared herself to listen. It wasn't random. It wasn't simple. Someone had wanted Elspeth Grant to open the door, or at least to believe she should. And someone in Brakey knew exactly why. Hamish spent the next morning weaving through the village, speaking with anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of the knock. The first to meet him were the McGregors, who ran the small inn on the main street. They swore they hadn't seen anyone leave or approach Elspeth's cottage, though Hamish noted the innkeeper's nervous tapping on the counter, an odd tick for someone claiming certainty. He let them finish, nodding as if satisfied, and left the observation unspoken. People always revealed more in their pauses than in their words. Next was young Ewan Munro, a shepherd who had a habit of wandering past the lane late at night. Ewan claimed he heard nothing unusual, only the usual clatter of Hogmanay celebrations and the distant laughter from the inn. Yet when Hamish asked him if he had walked closer to Elspeth's door, Ewan's gaze darted toward the horizon, and his voice dropped. I might have gone by, but I didn't stop." That small, almost invisible hesitation set off a bell in Hamish's mind. A boy like that would remember a knock, especially if it seemed deliberate. But he wasn't ready to say more, not yet. Hamish's next call was on Mrs. Calder again, hoping to press beyond her first evasive answers. This time, she fidgeted with her shawl and avoided his eyes. "I only heard something, that's all," she insisted, but her hands tightened as she spoke. Maybe it was a fox, or a branch. Could have been anything. "You were sure it was a knock last night?" Hamish said softly, stepping closer. "Or were you hoping someone else would think it was nothing?" She flinched, and Hamish noted it without comment. There was guilt or fear in her movement, though he couldn't yet tell which. Some truths are hidden in the body before they are in the tongue. Other villagers offered snippets of observation, each contradicting the last. The postman remembered delivering letters to Elspeth late that night, yet Hamish had already checked the post. All the mail had been collected hours earlier. The baker swore he had seen a figure leaving the lane around midnight, but couldn't say which way they went, adding only that the figure seemed hasty. Every story conflicted, yet each contained the same subtle element. Someone was present at the cottage when the knock occurred. Hamish returned to the scene, walking the frozen yard with careful steps. The footprints in the frost were faint, only partially formed, as if someone had been careful to leave no trace. But there was one set, small and precise, leading from the gate toward the side of the house and stopping at the back window. Not many people in Brakey wore shoes that fit like that. He crouched to inspect further, noticing a faint smear of mud on the sill, exactly where he had hesitated the day before. Someone had brushed against it, purposefully or inadvertently, and it suggested presence, not accident. As he stood, he considered the villagers' statements. Too many people had been willing to cooperate, offering details before being asked. Too many had held back, hiding nervous tics or hurried phrases. The discrepancies were not mistakes. They were carefully constructed masks. Each person had a story to tell, but Hamish could sense the deeper layer beneath. Someone had orchestrated this visit, and several people were aware of it, either as witnesses or accomplices. By the time the sun dropped low behind the hills, Hamish had built a mental map of subtle deceit. The knocker, the locked door, the prepared armchair, they were all pieces of a puzzle no one else had noticed. And somewhere among the villagers, someone knew more than they were saying. Hamish's eyes narrowed. He would need to wait to watch and to listen for the faintest slip. For in Brakey even a small crack in a lie could let in the light, and he intended to find it before the next knock came. Hamish spent the evening at the inn, nursing a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm long before he reached the bottom. The fire crackled and the villagers' chatter around him seemed harmless, but he could hear the undercurrent in their voices, the way they slipped into whispers when his back was turned, the quick smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Every person he had spoken to now presented a motive, some more subtle than others, each tangled in the fabric of Brakey life. Elspeth Grant had been independent, quiet, and careful with her modest savings, which in a village like Brakey made her unusual. There was the MacGregor Inn, which had suffered a minor financial setback last year and might have benefited from a sudden inheritance if Elspeth's affairs were unsettled. There was Mrs. Calder, whose jealousy of Elspeth's reputation for thrift and cunning had been whispered among women in the village for years. Even Ewan Munro, the shepherd boy, could have harboured resentment for reasons Hamish couldn't yet grasp, though the boy's hesitation suggested knowledge rather than malevolence. Each person had a reason, yet none alone explained the precision of the crime, the locked door, or the deliberate placement of the brass knocker. Hamish returned to the cottage after dark, lantern in hand. In the quiet of the frosted garden, he walked the perimeter slowly, thinking aloud to himself. A knock at midnight, a knocker laid out like a calling card, and the room locked from the inside. Whoever did this didn't just want to harm Elspeth, they wanted to control how she died. He knelt near the back window where the faint smear of mud had appeared. The angle suggested someone had leaned in, peered in, but not entered. A warning? A test? Or perhaps a message for someone else entirely? Back inside, he examined the furniture again, looking for more subtle clues. The arrangement of the armchair, the folded blanket, the unbroken tea, they all pointed to someone who understood Elspeth's routines intimately. This wasn't random violence, it was calculated, almost ceremonial. And yet the purpose remained unclear. The more Hamish considered each suspect, the more complex the web became. He thought of the MacGregor's inn, the neighbouring households, the people he had questioned and the unspoken connections among them. Elspeth had been known to settle small disputes quietly, to lend a listening ear, or to mediate village disagreements. Had someone held a grudge long enough to plan this? Or was it simple greed, the temptation of her hidden savings or valuables? But that didn't explain the precision of the midnight knock, or the theatrical placement of the knocker on her embroidered cloth. There was something symbolic here, something personal. Hamish paused by the table where the knocker lay. The brass was cool under his fingertips, its lion's head staring back at him like a silent witness. It had been removed with care, brought in, and placed deliberately. Whoever did it wanted recognition, a signature. That suggested pride or vengeance, not a random crime. The suspect's motives were interwoven: fear, jealousy, greed, and perhaps old grudges. Each one could account for part of the act, but none of them explained all of it. The more he untangled one thread, the more knots appeared. By the time he stepped outside again, the moon cast long skeletal shadows across the frost-hardened ground. Hamish felt the weight of the village pressing in, the gossip, the half-truths, the quiet secrets tucked behind every door. He knew that within this maze of motives, one strand would reveal the architect of the crime. He just had to follow it carefully, without missing the faintest sign, the smallest slip. In Brakey, people were polite, but they were also clever, and cleverness often masked darker intentions. Hamish's eyes narrowed as he scanned the cottages bathed in silver moonlight. Someone in this web of ordinary lives had orchestrated a scene of death with almost surgical precision. The question was not whether he would find them, but when, and under what guise they would finally reveal themselves. The following morning word spread quickly. A breakthrough had been made. Constable Fraser burst into Hamish's temporary office at the inn, nearly tripping over his own boots in excitement. "We've found it, Hamish. Or at least, we think we have. Look at this." He produced a small folded envelope, slightly crumpled and stained at the edges. Inside was a confession, short, scrawled in a hurried hand, claiming responsibility for Elspeth Grant's death. The writer admitted to sneaking in at midnight, removing the knocker to frighten her, and panicking when she collapsed. It was signed with initials Hamish recognized immediately. E.C. Mrs. Calder. The village exhaled as if a collective weight had lifted. The local press, already sniffing a story, declared the mystery solved. Mrs. Calder herself had been taken into custody, looking bewildered and pale. She insisted she hadn't meant to kill Elspeth, only to frighten her, but the authorities were content. The envelope, combined with her prior evasions, seemed to close the case neatly. Hamish, however, felt a twinge of unease. He examined the confession, turning the thin paper in his fingers. The handwriting was careful, almost practiced, and the pressure on the page inconsistent. It wasn't a spontaneous note of guilt. It had been composed with intention. He knew Mrs. Calder well enough to recognize her style. It didn't match. Something about the phrasing, the punctuation, even the way she signed her initials, suggested mimicry rather than ownership. He asked Fraser to show him the route Mrs. Calder was supposed to have taken that night. Walking it himself in the frosty dawn, Hamish noticed what the constable had overlooked. The back window where the faint mud smear remained would have required balance and agility she didn't possess. Her shoes were flat, the soles worn smooth. The mark on the sill was precise, deliberate, and could not have been made by her without risk of leaving other traces, but there were none. Returning to the inn, Hamish poured himself a cup of tea and stared out the window, watching smoke curl from chimneys across the village. The confession had created a tidy story, but tidy stories rarely sat right in his mind. A true culprit, he thought, rarely allowed themselves to be caught this easily. The knocker, the embroidery, the locked room, these were all too orchestrated, too theatrical. The note may have been planted to give someone a false sense of closure, to draw attention away from the real architect of the crime. He glanced at Mrs. Calder, now seated quietly in the back room under the constable's watchful eye. She muttered under her breath, rocking slightly, her gaze flitting from Hamish to the window and back again. If she were guilty, she would have confessed, Hamish thought. Fear alone wouldn't make someone orchestrate a detailed mimicry of guilt. Someone else was manipulating the scene from the shadows, letting the village celebrate a victory that didn't exist. That evening, Hamish returned to Elspeth's cottage alone. The moon was rising, painting the frost in silver light, and the silence seemed charged with anticipation. He crouched beside the hall table, touching the knocker lightly, feeling its weight once more. Somewhere in Brakey, the real criminal was watching, waiting for the next slip, the next careless word. They had created a trap of appearances, and the village had walked right into it. Hamish stood and drew a deep breath of cold, sharp air. The false confession had given the authorities their moment of triumph, but he could feel the strands of deception twisting beneath the surface. He would have to unravel them carefully, quietly, before the next move came. And when it did, he knew, the stakes would rise. For in Brakey, the shadows were patient, and a cunning mind could wait years to strike. And this one was still very much awake. Hamish returned to the inn before dawn, the village still wrapped in frost and silence. The night had a peculiar hush, the kind that made the smallest noises, creaking floorboards, the scrape of shutters, seem like whispers of secrets long kept. He poured himself another cup of tea, black, strong, and unmoving, and set it down beside the notebook where he had been recording every subtle inconsistency he had noticed over the last days. As he leafed through it, his eyes caught something he had almost missed, a passing remark from the postman about a dispute years ago, involving Elspeth Grant and the MacGregors over a parcel of land that had never materialized. It was fleeting, almost casual, and had seemed irrelevant at the time, but now it clicked. Hamish remembered old constable reports, stored in the archive for cases that had gone cold, minor village quarrels that had escalated quietly, resolved more by silence than by law. One report described a confrontation between Mrs. Calder and Elspeth over the same disputed parcel, and it hinted that the MacGregors had been involved as mediators, though some voices suggested they had taken sides. That confrontation had ended decades ago, with the matter officially closed. Yet in small villages like Brakey, old grudges rarely fade. They linger, entwined in daily interactions, resurfacing when least expected. Hamish's mind raced. The brass knocker, the precise midnight visit, the false confession, all could make sense if viewed through the lens of history rather than immediate motive. Someone had not just wanted Elspeth scared, they wanted to settle something that had been left unresolved years before. And the suspects weren't just unconnected individuals, they were all linked by this old dispute, their current behavior colored by past resentments. He revisited his earlier conversations with the villagers in memory, noting who had been unusually eager to volunteer information and who had been careful to appear uninvolved. Mrs. Calder's hesitation now seemed less like fear of discovery and more like fear of exposure. She had not acted alone, or at least she hadn't been entirely honest about her role. The MacGregors' innkeepers, too, had been strangely quick to support the official story, their calm almost defensive. Even Ewan Munro's reluctance to speak fully now hinted at a child's awareness of adult secrets, passed down through whispered warnings. Hamish set out again for the village archive, retracing the events that had never been fully recorded. He discovered letters, receipts, and minor complaints, traces of simmering tension between families that, at first glance, had appeared trivial. The pattern was subtle, small slights, claims of unfair advantage, hints of jealousy and rivalry. The current crime was not merely a reaction to Elspeth's savings or a whim of chance. It was the culmination of a long-standing web of grudges, carefully orchestrated to settle scores while creating the appearance of random chaos. Returning to Elspeth's cottage, Hamish walked slowly around the yard, eyes catching details that had previously escaped notice. The slight indentation in the frost where a bag might have been set down, the faint line of soot on the hearth, suggesting someone had lingered after the fire burned low, and the uneven dust on the mantel where small objects had been rearranged. Each sign hinted at someone revisiting the scene deliberately, someone who knew precisely how to stage the crime, and someone intimately familiar with the history of disputes in Brakey. Standing in the cold moonlight, Hamish realized that the crime's roots were far deeper than anyone had imagined. The truth was buried not just in the present night's events, but in decades of quiet rivalries and unspoken resentments. To unravel the mystery completely, he would need to trace these connections carefully, follow the hidden paths of memory and motive, and confront the lingering shadows that had finally taken lethal shape. And in a village like Brakey, where the past was always present, uncovering one secret would inevitably lead to another, darker than the first. Hamish spent the next morning pacing the inn's quiet dining room, letting the villagers go about their chores while he considered what none of the evidence yet revealed. The brass knocker, the midnight knock, the staged confession, all had been designed to mislead, but misdirection could only go so far if one watched closely enough. He needed something more subtle, something that would draw the truth out without forcing it. He settled on an idea that had served him well before. He would let the suspects reveal themselves through behavior rather than words. He called Mrs. Calder back under the pretense of allowing her a final chance to clarify her role in the crime. The small room smelled faintly of peat smoke and old tea, and Hamish seated her opposite him, leaving the brass knocker conspicuously on the table. "I've been thinking," he said softly, leaning back, hands folded, about how unusual that night must have seemed. Midnight, the locked door, the knocker. "You said it frightened you, yes?" Mrs. Calder nodded quickly, eyes wide. I admit I didn't mean for... I didn't know." Hamish let him pause, then tilted his head slightly, staring at the knocker as though lost in thought. "It's funny. People fear what they recognize. Yet someone brought this here, knowing you would see it, and now that it's here we can see reactions clearly. You notice how it gleams in the morning light. Does it remind you of anything?" Mrs. Calder's hands twitched. She avoided his gaze, brushing at her shawl as if it were suddenly uncomfortable. I don't know nothing." Hamish allowed a beat of silence, then slowly traced a finger along the table's edge, eyes never leaving hers. "Curious, isn't it? The knocker was taken from somewhere, placed here for effect. A simple object, but meaningful. A person who knows the value of details could see it in multiple ways, and one way perhaps too closely." Her lips pressed together, and for the first time Hamish noticed a small tremor in her hand. It wasn't fear of discovery, she had already confessed after all, but a subtle anxiety that suggested she was concerned someone else might know she hadn't acted alone. He leaned forward, voice soft, almost conversational. "Do you remember a dispute over the land, years ago? Something that never fully resolved?" Her eyes widened, and she let out a shaky breath, a barely audible yes. That was all. No words beyond the confession had passed her lips, but her reaction told Hamish more than any testimony could. The slight colour in her cheeks, the quick dart of her gaze toward the door as though seeking escape, the clenching of her shawl, it was all evidence. Hamish stood, moving around the table deliberately, letting his presence fill the space. "It seems there are layers here, Mrs. Calder. You weren't acting alone that night, were you? Someone else wanted the knocker left as a signal. Someone else wanted the village to believe a tidy story, while the real architect remained hidden." The tremor in her hands grew. She opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again, and Hamish realized she was caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The reaction was involuntary, but it was revealing. The subtle psychological pressure, combined with the presence of the knocker and Hamish's casual references to past disputes, had exposed a fissure in her deception, a crack that could now be followed to uncover the hidden hand behind the crime. Hamish stepped back, letting silence press against the walls. The faint whistle of wind through the inn's chimney seemed louder somehow, emphasizing the moment. He knew then that the unconventional tactic had worked. The suspect had inadvertently confirmed the existence of an accomplice, a second mind at play, someone who had orchestrated the events with patience and precision. The real puzzle, the one still lurking in the shadows, was finally beginning to reveal itself. Hamish had barely left Mrs. Calder's presence when the first disturbance arrived. Constable Fraser burst into the inn, face pale and breathless, waving a scrap of paper like a flag. "Hamish, the knocker! It's gone! Someone's taken it from the cottage!" Hamish's heart sank, though his face remained calm. He had known the brass knocker was more than a mere ornament. It was the silent witness, the keystone of the mystery. Without it, much of the evidence he had painstakingly gathered, the psychological pressure, the carefully observed reactions, even the hints of past grudges, risked being dismissed as conjecture. Together, they raced back to the Grant cottage, the frost crunching under their boots. Inside, Hamish's eyes swept over the hall table. The white cloth remained, folded perfectly, but the knocker itself was gone. No sign of forced entry, no disturbance, nothing to indicate theft other than the empty space. Someone had taken it deliberately, and in doing so had erased the centerpiece of the staged drama. Hamish crouched to inspect the cloth. It was immaculate, as if it had never borne the weight of metal. He ran his fingers along the edges and corners, noting the absence of smudges or fingerprints. Whoever had removed the knocker knew precisely how to handle it, just as carefully as whoever had placed it there. This wasn't random mischief. This was a calculated act of sabotage. Word spread through the village faster than the frost could melt. The MacGregors and a few early risers clustered near the lane, whispering, each glance filled with suspicion. Hamish noticed the subtle shifts in posture, the slight tightening of shoulders, the quick movement of eyes toward doors and windows. Everyone seemed to be watching everyone else. The theft had shaken the fragile equilibrium of trust that had existed for years, exposing fear, guilt, and protective instincts in equal measure. Back in the cottage, Hamish turned to Fraser. "Changes things. Whoever took the knocker is actively manipulating the investigation. They want the narrative controlled, the story tidy, so no one discovers the full truth. And they knew we were closing in." Fraser frowned. "But who, and why? If they wanted to hide it, why not destroy it?" Hamish shook his head. "Because some pieces of evidence are more dangerous when they vanish than when they're gone completely. Removing it sends a message, to us, to the village, to anyone who might be prying. It signals control, patience, and knowledge. Whoever did this is watching, waiting, and confident will miss the connections it held." He retraced his steps through the cottage, eyes scanning for overlooked details, the faint indentation on the floor where the knocker had rested, the slight disturbance in the dust along the mantel, and the faint scuff on the hearth's edge. Nothing else had been touched. Whoever had taken it had moved quickly, silently, leaving only the emptiness as a statement. Hamish's mind worked methodically. He considered the suspects. Mrs. Calder, whose subtle reactions had revealed an accomplice, the MacGregors, who had been unnaturally eager to present closure, Ewan Munro, whose hesitation suggested knowledge, and even peripheral witnesses whose nervous glances hinted at awareness. The act of taking the knocker suggested insider knowledge, a familiarity with the scene that only someone closely connected to the original crime could possess. Stepping outside into the icy morning air, Hamish surveyed the village again. Frost clung to the rooftops and lamplight glimmered faintly along Church Lane. In Brakey, silence could be louder than shouting, and the empty space where the knocker had been felt like a scream. The stakes had just risen. The real criminal, Hamish realized, was no longer simply hiding. They were maneuvering, shaping the investigation itself, daring him to follow. And if he misstepped, the truth might vanish completely, leaving the village trapped in a web of deception with no one to untangle it. Hamish had barely finished surveying the cottage when a shout rang out from the lane. He ran toward the sound, Fraser close behind, to find a small crowd gathering outside the MacGregor's inn. The front door was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, and the innkeeper, a stout man with a reddened face, was shouting something about blood. Inside, the scene was chaos. The MacGregor's assistant, a young man named Callum, lay sprawled on the floor, unconscious, a deep gash on his temple. Chairs had been knocked over in the struggle, and the ledger had been thrown to the ground, pages splayed like wings. There was no sign of the attacker, no footprints leading away in the frost, no broken glass, nothing to suggest a hasty escape. The air smelled faintly of oil from overturned lanterns, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Hamish knelt beside Callum, checking his pulse and breathing, relief washing over him when he found both steady. "He'll live," he murmured, though the shock in the room made everyone tense. "But this changes everything." Fraser looked bewildered. Another attack? But who, and why target him? He wasn't involved in the Grant case, was he? Hamish shook his head slowly, eyes scanning the room. Not directly. But he knows too much, or at least he's been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The real culprit wants to send a message, and they want us scrambling. He examined the scene carefully. The overturned chairs suggested a struggle, but the lack of footprints indicated the attacker had either been extraordinarily careful or had been let in by someone inside. The ledger's pages had been rifled through, but not stolen. It was as though the assailant wanted chaos without removing anything of immediate value, a show of control rather than theft. As Hamish rose to his feet, his eyes caught something near the doorway, a single small scrap of paper pinned beneath the doorstop. He retrieved it carefully, smoothing the crumpled edge. It was a note, written in the same careful hand as the false confession against Mrs. Calder, though the handwriting was slightly more confident, more assertive. "Stop digging, or next time you won't just watch from the sidelines," it read. Hamish's stomach tightened. The villain wasn't just reacting, they were orchestrating, predicting each step, and escalating when challenged. The knocker, the staged confession, now this attack. The game had become dangerous, personal, and direct. Brakey was no longer a village merely holding secrets, it had become a trap, and Hamish was at its centre. He turned to Fraser. "They're taunting us. Whoever this is knows we're close to uncovering the full picture. They want to destabilize the investigation, frighten witnesses, and above all, mislead us into making mistakes." Fraser swallowed hard, glancing at the still lying Callum. "But if they're so clever, how do we catch them?" Hamish's gaze drifted to the frost outside, to the silent cottages lined in shadow, and he allowed himself a slow, deliberate breath. "We observe, we anticipate, and we force them to act on their own terms. They've made the first move, but the next one belongs to us. The trick is not to react blindly, but to understand their patterns, their motives, their pride." The note in his hand felt heavier than its paperweight suggested. It was both a threat and a clue, a deliberate choice by someone confident that fear would paralyze rather than provoke. Hamish folded it carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket. The investigation had shifted dramatically. The villain was no longer distant, no longer hidden behind layers of deception. They were present, watching, testing, and willing to strike again. Hamish knew then that time was critical. Every hour the village remained unaware of the danger. The risk of another attack grew. The case had become a race, not just to solve a murder, but to prevent the next one. And in Brakey, where silence held more power than shouting, Hamish realized that the real test had only just begun. Hamish returned to the inn late that night, the village asleep beneath a thin layer of frost and moonlight. He sat quietly at the corner table, the note from the MacGregor's attack folded carefully before him. Fraser had gone home to check on Callum, leaving Hamish alone with the quiet hum of the fire and his own thoughts. He traced the events of the last days in his mind: the midnight knock, the brass knocker, the staged confession, Mrs. Calder's twitching hands, and now the attack on Callum. Each move had seemed chaotic, unpredictable, but Hamish sensed an invisible thread connecting them. He picked up his notebook and began reading over his own observations. Something small, almost trivial, caught his eye, the way certain villagers had described hearing the knock at midnight. Most spoke vaguely, as if dismissing it, but Ewan Munro, the shepherd boy, had hesitated. He remembered the sound differently than the others. Hamish reread the line, I might have gone by, but I didn't stop. Not a denial, not a confirmation, but a pause, a hesitation, and then the faint scuff on the back windowsill, the indentation in the frost outside the cottage, the smear of mud that seemed to stop and start at just the right places. It all pointed to someone small, light on their feet, moving deliberately but leaving minimal trace. Hamish leaned back in his chair. The knocker, removed with precision, and the staged confession had been meant to distract, but the true signature of the culprit was in the details only a careful observer would notice. Someone had orchestrated the spectacle, yes, but someone's habits and familiarity had betrayed them. The small, seemingly insignificant choices, the careful removal of the knocker, the placement of the note beneath the doorstop, the timing of the attack on Callum, were all consistent with a single pattern of control and calculation. He thought of Mrs. Calder's reactions, the twitching hands, the glance toward the door, the hesitation when pressed about past disputes. She had been a pawn, yes, or perhaps a minor accomplice, but she had revealed more than she realized. The real orchestrator had used her, relied on her familiarity with the village's routines, and depended on the subtle fear she inspired. Hamish closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the sequence of events. The midnight knock had been deliberate, chosen to provoke. The brass knocker itself was symbolic, intended to draw attention. The confession had created a false sense of closure, lulling the authorities into complacency, and the attack on Callum, meant as a warning, had confirmed that the perpetrator was confident, cunning, and fully aware of the investigation's progress. Each step was a calculated escalation, revealing the personality and methods of the villain. Opening his eyes, Hamish smiled faintly. The pattern had been in plain sight all along, embedded in the behavior of the village, the placement of objects, the timing of actions, and the tiny inconsistencies that everyone else had overlooked. The details that seemed minor, the hesitation of a boy, the twitch of a hand, the precise scuff of a shoe, were the fingerprints of a mind far more meticulous than anyone had imagined. He folded the notebook, rising from the chair with renewed purpose. The village, peaceful under the pale moonlight, seemed to hold its breath, unaware that the invisible thread connecting every event had been discovered. Hamish knew that understanding this pattern meant he could anticipate the next move, see through the orchestrated chaos, and finally uncover the mastermind who had turned Breaky into a stage for fear and deception. The pieces were aligning, and at last the path to the truth was becoming clear. Hamish returned to the Grant cottage the next morning, the frost glinting like shards of glass along the lane, and let his eyes sweep over the familiar, quiet room. Everything was as it had been, except of course for the brass knocker, gone now, leaving a void that still felt like an accusation. He paced slowly, thinking back over the pattern he had pieced together: deliberate acts, misdirection, psychological pressure, and now the escalating attacks. The culprit's logic had been methodical, almost clinical, but that only heightened the urgency. Whoever it was had a purpose far deeper than simple greed or petty revenge. He returned to Mrs. Calder, not as an interrogator but as an observer, noting her subtle anxieties, the way her eyes flicked to shadows, how her voice faltered whenever the old land dispute was mentioned. She had been honest about some things, false about others. It was clear she had been used, but the use was purposeful, a means to an end for someone who understood fear and influence better than any ordinary criminal. Hamish's mind shifted to the village itself and to the careful orchestration that had unfolded, the midnight knock, the knocker as a symbol, the staged confession, the attack on Callum. Each move had been intended not merely to terrify, but to manipulate, to control the perception of every observer, to make Breaky itself a stage for a dark drama. The breakthrough came as he reviewed the old dispute files once more. Something that had seemed trivial, Elspeth's small, overlooked role in mediating the parcel disagreement, suddenly took on a sinister clarity. Hamish realized the true target had never been her money, nor even her life in isolation. It had been her authority, her quiet moral influence in the village, and her ability to hold the subtle balance among neighbours. The villain's aim had been to destabilize that balance, to assert dominance not just physically but psychologically, by controlling how the village interpreted events, by deciding who appeared guilty and who seemed innocent. The mastermind had been shaping perception itself, a power far more profound than theft or revenge. Hamish allowed himself to smile faintly. The villain's motive was obsession, a need to manipulate and dominate, to construct a perfect narrative in which they alone determined the outcome. That need had driven them to extremes, murder staged as misfortune, a false confession, the theft of evidence, and even the intimidation of innocent parties. The careful attention to detail, the symbolic gestures, the use of familiar faces as pawns, all revealed someone not only consumed by control but fascinated by the psychological ripple effects of their actions. He thought again of the brass knocker, its weight and symbolism, and of the note left at the MacGregor's Inn. Each act had been designed to provoke a reaction, to gauge obedience and fear, to assert superiority over both the villagers and the authorities. The crime had never been about money, it had been about dominance, the satisfaction of seeing one's design unfold exactly as intended. The level of calculation, of patience, and of understanding of human behaviour was what had made the series of events so baffling. Hamish walked slowly through the cottage one last time, eyes on the folded cloth where the knocker had rested. The real crime, he realized, was the manipulation itself. The murderer had sought to bend the entire village to their will, to make them unwitting participants in a psychological experiment of control, fear, and obedience. It was audacious, terrifying, and brilliant in its simplicity, and it explained why the villain had escalated so quickly when challenged. For the first time, Hamish saw the person behind the chaos not merely as a criminal, but as a strategist of human behaviour, someone who had studied, predicted, and exploited every response. The hidden motive was now clear. It had never been about what was seen, it had always been about what was felt, about the control of perception, and about the thrill of orchestrating a perfect tableau of fear and obedience. Understanding that, Hamish knew he could anticipate the next move, but it would require patience, subtlety, and every ounce of insight he had honed over years in villages far smaller and quieter than Breaky. Hamish stood in the quiet of the inn's back room, the day's frost melting slowly against the sunlit windows, reflecting in a way that made the wooden floorboards glow faintly. The villagers had begun to relax, murmuring about the supposed resolution, whispering praises for Constable Fraser and the authorities who had solved the case. Yet Hamish could not settle. The threads he had followed, the knocker, the false confession, Mrs. Calder's twitching hands, the attack on Callum, did not lead to a tidy conclusion. He had pieced together the hidden motive, traced the psychological design of the crime, and yet a nagging sense of incompleteness lingered. Someone was still missing from the picture. He retraced the sequence of events in his mind, aloud this time. The knocker was removed carefully. The confession was staged. Mrs. Calder reacted to pressure, Callum was attacked. Someone is orchestrating from the shadows. He paused, eyes narrowing. Something still did not add up. The person manipulating events with such sophistication would have anticipated every move he had made, and yet one detail remained unexplained. A set of footprints noticed faintly in the frost outside the grand cottage, almost imperceptible, but moving toward the lane at the very moment Hamish had been observing the initial crime scene. Small, light, and precise, they had been dismissed as residual from a villager, but their direction and timing suggested intent. Hamish's mind flashed to Ewan Munro, the shepherd boy, whose hesitations had first caught his attention. He had assumed the boy had knowledge but had been too young to participate. Yet the footprints, the precise timing, the boy's subtle glances, and the faint familiarity with village routines all hinted at someone closer to the orchestrator than anyone had guessed. He left the inn and moved quietly along the frost-hardened lane, retracing steps he had memorized from the village layout. A sense of anticipation prickled his skin. His eyes scanned every shadow, every window, every faint disturbance in the snow. Then, at the back of the MacGregor's inn, a figure slipped between the shadows. A quick movement barely noticeable, but deliberate. Hamish's instincts, honed over years of quiet observation, ignited. He followed, silent, careful. The figure led him to a shed at the edge of the village, a place so seldom used that no one thought to check it. Hamish crouched, peering through a crack in the weathered boards. Inside, Mrs. Calder sat quietly, but not alone. Across from her, a figure he had never suspected. Ewan Munro, older than he appeared at first glance, deliberate in his movements, arranging small props, the knocker, a notebook, and a series of notes detailing the village's patterns. Hamish's mind raced. The boy had been trained, guided, perhaps even instructed by Mrs. Calder, but the brilliance and patience behind the orchestration, the psychological manipulation, the timing, the staged events, emanated from the boy now revealed. Hamish stepped forward, his presence unmistakable. "Ewan," he said, calm but commanding. "You've been careful, but every pattern leaves a trace. The real mastermind isn't who anyone expected, is it?" Ewan froze, a faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. Mrs. Calder rose slowly, her hands trembling. He thought he was helping," she stammered, "but I didn't mean for it to go this far." Hamish's gaze sharpened. The genius behind the crime, the one who had manipulated the village, planted fear, and guided reactions, had been hiding in plain sight. Not the obviously anxious Mrs. Calder, not the other villagers, but the one who could move between innocence and cunning with the perfect balance. A mind both young enough to escape suspicion and old enough to execute a plan flawlessly. The final twist, Hamish realized, was not just the unmasking of the villain, it was the revelation that the mastermind had been right under everyone's noses all along, a careful observer turned subtle manipulator, using others as instruments in a symphony of deception. The case, he now understood, would demand one last act of precision, to confront the mind that had orchestrated every detail while ensuring that the fragile web of the village's life did not unravel entirely under the weight of truth. Hamish stepped closer to the shed, the frost crunching under his boots like the subtle drumbeat of inevitability. Ewan Munro and Mrs. Calder remained frozen, the weight of discovery pressing down on them. Hamish's eyes swept over the scattered items, the brass knocker, the meticulously folded notes, the ledger-like notebook detailing every movement, hesitation, and whispered conversation in the village. Every piece told a story that no one had noticed before, each detail a deliberate manipulation of perception. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen chaos and ordered it in his mind 1,000 times over. "It's all here. Every subtle hesitation, every twitch, every carefully staged act. The knocker, the midnight visit, the false confession. They weren't just attempts to frighten, they were experiments in control. Each person you used, each lie you let them tell, was a pawn on the board. But the pattern led me here. Always to you, Ewan. The boy's eyes flickered, a mix of fear, defiance, and an almost imperceptible pride. Mrs. Calder stepped forward, hands wringing, finally admitting the truth. He planned it, Hamish. I thought I was helping, but he thought it was clever, so clever. He knew how to make everyone see what he wanted them to see, even me. Hamish nodded, letting the admission hang in the air. Then he crouched near the floor, pointing to the faint indentation in the frost from the night of the first knock. You see this? The path you took to the back window. The small, deliberate steps. Everyone ignored them, thinking them insignificant. But that was the first signature of your plan. You relied on the village missing what was right in front of them, and most did. Only careful observation could reveal the sequence. He moved to the spot where the knocker had been placed, the embroidered cloth now disturbed, the choice of object, the placement, even the timing. Midnight, when people are half asleep, when memories are unreliable, was not random. Each act tested reactions, measured fear, and mapped influence. And the false confession? That was your crowning stroke, designed to divert attention and create a sense of resolution while the real design continued unnoticed. Ewan's lips trembled, and Hamish could see the boy's mind racing, realizing that the very attention to detail that had protected him had also revealed him. It wasn't just mischief, Hamish continued. It was a psychological experiment, and the real danger was your understanding of human nature. You predicted hesitation, misdirection, and loyalty, and you exploited every one of them. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, the only sound the whisper of wind through the nearby trees. Then Hamish turned, his eyes meeting Mrs. Calder's. You'll answer for your part, of course, but the orchestrator, the one who planned this with such meticulous care, will face justice as well. Ewan's expression hardened, a flicker of defiance in the face of inevitability. Yet as Hamish stepped toward the door to call for Constable Fraser, the boy moved with a speed born of practice and vanished into the shadows behind the shed. Hamish cursed under his breath, but did not panic. Ewan had planned for contingencies, and the boy's escape only confirmed the mind behind the crime was as clever as Hamish had anticipated. Later, as the village began to settle back into cautious normalcy, Hamish explained the sequence of events to Fraser and the remaining villagers. Every hesitation, every twitch, every overlooked footprint now made sense. The knocker, the false confession, the carefully staged attack, they had all been signs of an intelligence several steps ahead. The unseen pattern, the subtle psychological manipulations, and the deliberate misdirection had almost fooled everyone, and only close attention and patient deduction had uncovered the truth. Yet the unresolved escape of the mastermind left a chill over the village, a reminder that brilliance can evade capture, and that even in the midst of revealed secrets, some shadows remain. Hamish watched the sun dip behind the hills, the frosted village bathed in a golden glow, and allowed himself a faint smile. Justice had been partially served, the pattern uncovered, the motives exposed, but the game, as always, had one final, elusive player still at large, leaving an unsettling echo of unfinished business in its wake. Hamish left the village square just as twilight deepened into a violet dusk, the soft glow of lamp-posts reflecting off the frost-streaked windows. The streets were quiet now, the chatter of relieved villagers replaced by the distant clatter of carts and the occasional bark of a dog. Everything seemed peaceful, almost deceptively so. Yet Hamish walked slowly, deliberately, aware that the brilliance of the unseen mastermind had left its mark not just on the village, but on his own sense of certainty. Even after explaining the chain of events to Constable Fraser and the remaining villagers, there remained a small knot in Hamish's mind. He replayed the sequence of clues, the brass knocker, the staged confession, the attack on Callum, and the cryptic notes. And one minor detail refused to settle. A faint smudge on the windowsill at the grand cottage, almost invisible except to someone trained to notice, had never quite matched the pattern of the boy's footprints or Mrs. Calder's movements. It had been overlooked at first, a subtle anomaly, and yet its very subtlety suggested intention rather than accident. Hamish could not shake the sense that it was a message, left deliberately, pointing toward something more, something unseen. The wind whispered across the rooftops as he passed the inn, carrying with it the faint smell of peat smoke and damp earth. Hamish paused and glanced back at the village, every lamp and shadow seeming to hide secrets just beyond reach. The thrill of the chase, the intricate dance of observation and deduction, had not ended with the explanation of the visible crimes. In Brakey, he knew, a hidden observer always lingered, watching for missteps, calculating the next move. And somewhere, the mastermind, brilliant, patient, and cautious, remained out there, biding their time. Hamish's thoughts turned to the villagers, each now armed with a partial understanding of the events. They had experienced fear, confusion, and relief in equal measure, but none had grasped the full scope of the psychological game played out among them. That gap, he realized, was intentional, and it kept the balance of control tilted slightly toward the unseen hand. Even in apparent resolution, some truths remained beyond reach, and some lessons were learned only in shadows and half-glances. As he walked along the frost-lined lane, Hamish's keen eyes caught the faint glimmer of a folded scrap of paper caught on the low branches of a hawthorn bush. He bent to retrieve it, careful not to disturb the frost. Unfolding the note, he found only a single word scrawled in neat, precise handwriting: soon. The simplicity of the message belied its threat and its promise. Someone was watching still, perhaps anticipating his next investigation, perhaps waiting for him to follow the invisible thread into another puzzle, yet unsolved. Hamish folded the paper slowly, tucking it into his coat pocket. The chill of the evening seemed to sharpen his senses, and he allowed a small smile to curve his lips. The case had been partially unravelled, the pattern exposed, the hidden motives understood. But the ultimate game, the deeper mystery, had not ended. In Brakey, secrets were patient, and cunning minds could wait for years to strike again. He continued walking toward the edge of the village, the soft crunch of frost beneath his boots marking the rhythm of thought and observation. Behind him, the lights of Brakey flickered warmly, a village seemingly restored to calm. Ahead, the horizon stretched in twilight blues and purples, an open road for another mystery waiting to unfold. Hamish knew that the world of shadows, misdirection, and human cunning was never truly quiet, and the detective's mind, always alert, was already scanning the possibilities, ready for the next game. Even as he vanished into the evening, one thought lingered in his mind. A mystery never ends. It only waits for the one who notices the signs, who reads between the lines, who follows the subtlest of patterns. And Hamish Macbeth, patient, observant, and relentless, would be ready.